hand over the time to the chairperson of this debate, Ms. Deborah Soon, head of news segment at MediaCorp. Ms. Soon.
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first post-lunch slump session of the Singapore Perspectives 2015. I will do my best to keep the session moving along so you don't fall asleep, but it will be mainly up to the scintillating speakers, erudite speakers, to scintillate you as they debate a rather complex and convoluted motion. I have to say, though, only a mind similarly complex and convoluted as Mr. Jandas Devans could have come up with this, which reads, "This conference resolves that pragmatism remains important and should be retained as our governing philosophy." Now, since Mr. Jandas arm-twisted me into this, I thought I could crack one joke at his expense. Actually, maybe two. If I'm not here next year, you all will know why as well. Now, to me, the motion assumes several things. First, that pragmatism is currently in place, is a governing philosophy, and is ours, in other words, shared. Is pragmatism really a philosophy? Is this what has driven us as a collective and a people? Or does this refer to the government or the ruling party, or both? Is it whatever works? Do policy efficiencies and outcomes justify pragmatic means? Has it always been our governing philosophy, or has this evolved over the years? Some thoughts to ponder on. I'm sure our speakers will enlighten us. A little bit on the format. We will have two opening remarks of 5 minutes each, followed by a challenge and rebuttal round. Questions 1 minute long, responses 2 minutes each. We will have 4 rounds. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the teams to you. For the proposition, Mr. Tong Yi, the director of the Thought Collective, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Dean, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and for the opposition, Mr. Vikram Khanna, Associate Editor, The Business Times, and Associate Professor Eugene Tan, School of Law, Singapore Management University. You've seen all of them on television. They are experts, don't need me to do anything. The first thing now I have to do is to ask you all to vote on the poll question, which is a bit sharper than a motion. Pragmatism should be retained as Singapore's governing philosophy. Those of you who agree, in other words, with the proposition, please vote 1 and send it in. Those of you who disagree, press 2 and send it in. Can you all hear me clearly, or is this very echoey? All right? Awkward silence as usual. I think we're almost done with the poll. And wow, over 72%, nearly 73% feel that pragmatism has to be retained as our governing philosophy. How interesting. Let's see how they manage to convince you. Without further ado, I will now invite the first speaker of the proposition, Tong Yi, to make his opening remarks. Tong Yi, your time starts now.
Good afternoon. Honestly, the sheer fact that I'm standing here at the IPS Singapore Perspectives Conference debating with some of the brightest minds in Singapore is perhaps one of the least pragmatic things I've agreed to do over the past few years. Being a 2-time repeat student and having only earned a past degree in NUS, and this is theatre studies, mind you, I really do not know what insane ideological point I'm trying to prove by potentially making a fool of myself on national TV. So in preparation for this, I had time to seriously reflect and consider. And I came to the conclusion that if I'm going to make the best of this learning opportunity, if I'm going to use this platform to make some profoundly poignant points, right, that will somehow make Singapore proud, then I might as well win while I'm doing it, which is why I'm on Kishore's side and not the others. But that really is a point in itself. I've been a social entrepreneur for over a decade now. When IPS first invited me as a debater for this year's conference, I was politely given a choice of which side I would prefer to argue on. And I remember a slight look of surprise from Su Fen, right, when I matter-of-factly said that I would definitely be arguing for pragmatism. 5 to 6 years ago, I would have even surprised myself. One would think that social entrepreneurs are bold, innovative radicals, full of ideals and giving the genuine desire to begin to serve community, and doing so in a very sustainable way. It is a bold and compelling dream and immensely fashionable among young people today. But at least in part, I think these ideals have held true for me, but maybe not so in the recent years. The path of social entrepreneurship, if anything, has been a real education on the profound value of pragmatism in our lives, and for me at least, it's a grounding principle on which I choose to live. I learned very quickly in my own pursuit of ideals that I really should not keep falling for my own hype or to buy my own bullshit. Saving the world, creating systems that promoted equality for all, making Singapore a place where people could all have equal opportunity was something that I felt I needed to contribute to be a part of. It was part of basically my own suffering as I grew up as a young person in Singapore. But being able to deliver on that particular promise, that particular social promise, to retain the integrity of being able to serve others is something that I quickly learned dependent upon sound financial principles, a strong grasp of reality, the accurate reading of current market conditions, and yes, taking into account the myriad personalities of working partners and collaborators that we have to somehow begin to work with. And if I genuinely wanted to pursue a career to live my ideals, then I must first ground that in a practical reality. It's not the most popular thing to say, but one I believe we all have to hear and maybe have the courage to follow. Make no mistake, we need idealism, we need inspiration, and we need values. But pragmatism is not mutually exclusive to us believing and wanting to achieve a world that's better than the one that we currently have. Rather, it is pragmatism that remains a foundation for idealism. In the same way that it was our parents' and pioneer generations' focus on pragmatic jobs that gave us perhaps the ability for us to follow our ideals today, it is very much similar itself, right, to the generation of shipyard workers that allowed for today's cupcake makers. Right? I do not find pragmatism to be an option that invites cynicism. In fact, pragmatism demands an exceptional leadership and moral courage. Pragmatism is not an expedient reading of any one given context and simply adapting ourselves to suit the demands of the times. Pragmatism is a reading of all contexts. It's including the moral one, the financial one, the political one, the cultural one, and yes, the sustainable one. And I've come to a sound conclusion that this really itself is the way of seeing things that perhaps would actually guarantee us the best success in the long game. Can the government stand against inequalities, right, when the very nature of the world is unequal? I get that these are key narratives for campaigns and even elections, but governance, I'm not so sure. I found that when governments start wearing the underpants on the outside and of the red and blue leotards, right, when they start flying around fighting for causes, they tend to look very ridiculous, at least eventually. I cannot complain, no matter how hard I want to believe, that we have shaken off the fact that we remain one of the smallest nation-states in the world. Has our success in supplying water for ourselves deceived us into thinking that we have somehow resolved the food problem or our complete dependence upon others for food? Has our stellar education and the fact that we can hold important debates in fancy hotels convinced us that our thoughts and perspectives are something that will even be heard in a politically mild landscape? When push comes to shove, can Singapore really afford to push back and somehow still keep these wings on which we fly? Pragmatism is hardly popular. It is rarely inspiring, and sometimes it's oftentimes sobering. But what it guarantees is that pragmatic leaders are grounded in realities and not ideologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Tong Yi. Sorry I had to interrupt you, but this is the way debates work. Can I now invite the first speaker for the opposition, Vikram, to speak.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have to say that were it not for Janadas's persuasive powers, I would not be here. I'm participating in this debate with some trepidation. I mean, to argue against pragmatism in the context of Singapore is like arguing against motherhood. So as you can see from the results that you voted for, I should say I have only 5 minutes, so I can only sketch some broad themes, which I hope we can flesh out a little later. I mean, one doesn't oppose pragmatism. I mean, it is good. I think the first part of the motion is taken. It is useful by definition. But you know, the motion says it should be retained as our governing philosophy. Not it should be an important element of our government philosophy, not that our governing philosophy should be tempered by pragmatism, but pragmatism should be it. That's it, and nothing else. Now, that kind of sticks in my throat a little bit. I don't know if you saw the interview that Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong gave to the media a few days ago, where he was asked about pragmatism, and he said, yes, well, pragmatism is good. I mean, whatever works is good. But there are certain things that are what he called unshakable. The rule of law, meritocracy, interethnic harmony, these are there forever, not out of pragmatism, because they are good intrinsically in and of themselves. And I think there are certain things in life that are good intrinsically in and of themselves. The other word in the motion that I had a problem with is that we should retain pragmatism, as if we have always been pragmatic. I know a lot of things have been sold as pragmatism, packaged as pragmatism, framed as being pragmatic, but I think we need to raise a few questions as to whether they really have been. I can say this in the context of, just to give a few examples, which I hope we can flesh out later, our approach to welfare, our approach to housing, our approach to education and immigration, our approach to information. These are some of the areas where I think we have been short of being pragmatic. The other issue I have is pragmatism for whom? What pragmatic for whom? What is pragmatic for me may not be pragmatic for you. You can say pragmatic for society, yes. But I think as society becomes more diverse and more complex, that becomes a much more difficult proposition to deliver on. There are also issues on our economic policy of the past. I think we have taken some very bold, visionary, radical steps, done some radical things which in retrospect may look like pragmatic, but at the time the decisions were made, they certainly were not. So when we talk about the economy, I think we have to look at the future, we look at innovation, we look at creativity. These require things that go beyond just pragmatism. I think a case can be made for that, and I hope we'll be able to make it. But at the end of the day, really, I think, I hope we can make the case that, yes, pragmatism is important, but it also needs to be accompanied by other things, by idealism, inspiration, principle, conviction, a moral compass. Pragmatism alone is not enough. I think I would recast the motion to say we need a pragmatic approach to our governing philosophy. That means, yes, we have elements of pragmatism, but we also have elements of principle. We also have elements of morality. We also have elements of conviction. And we also have elements of compassion and justice. If we say pragmatism should be our governing philosophy, I think what we're doing, we're elevating pragmatism itself to the level of an ideology. And that's not very pragmatic. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram. Can I ask the people who are controlling the sound not to cut off my mic, because then I can't interrupt them? Thank you very much. See, Janadas, we're all trying to recast the motion for you. Can I now invite, we're going to start what is called the response and challenge round, or a rebuttal round. I'd like to invite the first person from the proposing team to issue the challenge. Kishore, you have 1 minute. If you could take the mic and stand at your seat. Stand at your seat.
Thank you, Vikram. I'm glad you said that pragmatism is like motherhood. So please don't vote against your mother in the final round. You know, you said that we should have balanced pragmatism with morality, with idealism, implying that they sort of exclude each other. But you know, Mr. Rajaratnam said many years ago, and I quote, "Unsentimental pragmatism has made life more human, more dignified, and more hopeful for Singaporeans." So what could be more moral and more idealistic than what Mr. Rajaratnam has spelled out?
Eugene, I need to invite you to respond to that question or challenge from Kishore.
I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about pragmatism, we are concerned about pragmatism being elevated to the point that we do not consider other imperatives. Right? So putting it another way, right, it's not just about getting to the summit of the mountain, but also about how we get to the mountain. Are we going to lay people off by the side just because we want to pursue that? So I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the morality, the principles, and the values, right? Because the shared purpose will always be there. But how do we discipline that shared purpose? And I think this is where we take the view that pragmatism is not enough. And in fact, if anything, pragmatism will get us into a lot more trouble. So,
You have another minute if you want to continue.
Yeah,
another minute.
so I think this is where we're coming from, that I think it's important for us to continue to recognize that you need to balance pragmatism. So we're not saying do away with pragmatism, we are saying we need to be even-handed. Right? We need to be pragmatic, but we also certainly need to look at concerns, particularly at this stage of our development, right, where the material needs are more or less satisfied. We need to then go beyond those material needs and deal with the aspirations, because how do we build a nation when everyone is driven by pragmatic considerations? How do we build a soul? How do we get people to feel that this is a place that they will stay regardless of whether things are good or bad? And I think this is where we take the view that pragmatism alone will do us in. Pragmatism will get us through the day, but we need more than pragmatism to get us through the night. And I think this is where, as a society, we need to go beyond the material concerns to focus on the post-material aspirations.
Okay, thank you. Now you have a minute to issue the challenge to the proposing team.
I'd like to ask the proposition. They have presented pragmatism as something which is workable. And Vikram and I don't disagree with that. But we want to ask, isn't pragmatism ultimately ideological? Right? That in the end, that pragmatism will actually kill discussion, right? That it will prevent us from looking at other alternatives, because what is pragmatic is the path that we should take. It tells us focus on what works, right? But it doesn't tell us how it works, how we're going to get there. So the question is, for the proposition is, how are we going to build a nation? Right? Because if we have people who treat this place very much like a hotel, people will say, well, it doesn't make sense for me to continue here any longer. We might as well up and go. Then I think, the past 50 years would have been a waste. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Tong Hee, you are going to respond. You have 2 minutes, starting from now.
I think one of the things that amazes me most is, and this is an anecdotal experience, I just had the privilege of coming from one of our ITEs. This is an ITE Central. And I do remember growing up in Singapore, completely feeling that why is it, that Singapore doesn't have some sense of equality or justice, and basically we stereotype, one group over another. But stepping to the ITE campus, right, and seeing basically those youth speaking to me, right, in a way itself that spoke of confidence, that spoke of, dignity, I was absolutely proud of the fact itself that we have, I guess, a country that has really built a facility like that, right? And I would say itself, the IT itself is it was an idealism. It's an idealism itself to create equal education for all. But I do remember that it took some time to get there, right? So when we are pragmatic and we begin to build things, I mean, if you are calling yourself that for right now, we have an ability to just say that at this point in time, we should have both this and this. I really think that's a question of time. And that in time itself, right, you will begin to see that with the foundation of pragmatism, you eventually itself will be able to fulfill, I guess, all the idealisms that we do stand for as a nation.
You have another 45 seconds if you want to continue to talk about it before you challenge. If not, we will...
I don't have anything else.
If not, carry on. You can carry on issuing the challenge to the Opposing team now.
Yeah.
I don't have
Kishore is
tag
going to take
team.
over.
It's a tag team.
Tag team.
Um,
Tact team.
You mentioned, the most surprising thing you said was pragmatism at the end of the day is an ideology. I mean, as far as I know, that's a contradiction. An ideological approach is the exact opposite of pragmatism because you follow what the ideology says and not what the pragmatism says. I think it was John Kenneth Galbraith who said that I react pragmatically. Where the market works, I'm for that. Where the government is necessary, I'm for that. I'm deeply suspicious of somebody who says, I'm in favor of privatization or in favor of government. That's ideology. How can you confuse ideology with pragmatism?
Thank you, Kishore. And is the...
Sorry,
Vikram, could I ask you to rise,
yes.
please? Thank you.
I have to, I'll speak on behalf of Eugene. I think just to clarify, I think what is an ideology is when somebody says pragmatism alone should be a governing principle. Pragmatism and nothing else. That has the effect of elevating pragmatism to the level of an ideology. And I think that's a fair statement to make.
Eugene, are you going to respond as well, or you're done? You have more time.
Well, since Professor Kishore Mahbubani quotes an economist, so let me quote an economist in return. Douglas North said that strong moral and ethical codes of a society are the cement of social stability, which make an economic system viable. Right? So I think in the end it's important, beyond looking at the pragmatics that is required in the situation, that it is also important for us to look at what is it that we hope to make out of a certain policy. That, you said that pragmatism, that it's not an ideology, but I would submit that it is an ideology, right? Simply because it tells you how to go about doing things, working on the basis of what works.
You now have some time to issue the challenge to the proposing team. Next challenge. Vikram, are you going to do that, or? You have a minute.
Okay, yeah. Kishore, I think I'll be a little kinder to you than you were to us. I will.
Brownie points.
As you're a foreign policy expert, I will ask you a question on foreign policy. Singapore supported the Iraq war. Was that pragmatic, and was that right?
I must say, that's an excellent question. I give him points for asking a very good question. And the simple answer is that it was a good, pragmatic decision on the part of Singapore to support the Iraq war. Because if you look at the foreign policy alternatives that Singapore had at that time, what choices it had, what it had to do, it was clear that on balance, it was better off for Singapore to support the Iraq war. Because many of you probably do not know of the remarkable amount of benefits that Singapore has got as a result of that. Because as a result of the goodwill that we built up in Washington, D.C., we developed a much closer defense relationship with the United States. As a result of building up a closer defense relationship with the United States, we expanded the geopolitical space for Singapore, and we had much more freedom of action than a small state could have had on its own. And as we look ahead, and as we think about how we defend ourselves in the long term, it pays to have this close defense relationship with the United States of America. And I can tell you that small states that ignore geopolitical realities and assume that they can just take a moral stand and get away with it are the states that get into trouble in the long run.
Thank you, Kishore. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now invite you to vote again to see whether or not your views have changed, whether you've been convinced by either side, particularly the opposition, to change your mind. The question is, pragmatism should be retained as Singapore's governing philosophy. Those of you who agree, please press 1, and those of you who disagree, please press 2. And we will have your answers. Oh, wow. Well done to the opposition. Very interesting. And we will open the floor to questions and see whether or not any of you manage to tilt the balance again. And but before I do that, I will ask each of them a question myself. For the proposition, I would like to ask, is pragmatism a philosophy, or is it merely a means to an end? Yes, I'm asking you that question. I'm allowed to ask you one question, apparently.
Sorry, I was looking at the poll results.
Do I have to repeat the question?
Pragmatism actually is a very deep philosophy that goes back a long, long time. There's even a school of philosophy called pragmatism. And I guess over time, humanity accumulates wisdom. And as part of that wisdom, societies have learned that to succeed, to be able to deliver a good life for its citizens, to be able to ensure that people can escape wars, they have developed this philosophy of pragmatism. And it's not just, if it's just a means to an end, then presumably you would say anything goes. But I think you notice that most of the philosophers who have argued in favor of pragmatism suggest that if your goal is to create a better life for your people, if your goal at the end of the day is to ensure that people are better off rather than worse off, then that's why you should move towards pragmatism. And you find roots of pragmatism, by the way, in all the great cultures in the world, not just in Western philosophy. You find it in Indian philosophy, in Chinese philosophy. So it's something that is found all over the world. And the fact that it exists in all cultures and for a long period of time suggests it's a philosophy and not just a means to an end.
Thank you. And now to the opposition. Surely pragmatism remains important for Singapore. For the success of Singapore in the long run, how would you rate it compared with other values and ideals you think the government should consider in terms when it governs in how it governs Singapore?
I think certainly pragmatism is important. I spoke earlier about the need for us to be even-handed, looking at what are pragmatic considerations and looking at what's not, what's also what sort of moral objectives, what sort of aspirational concerns that we can address. So let me give you an example, right? So we all talk about how globalization has enabled Singapore to prosper. And I think it's true, right? But we also know that globalization doesn't lift all boats to the same level, right? And so for a long time, we have sort of worked on a premise that, well, too bad, right? Most people have benefited, so it's the utilitarian perspective. That works for us very well. It's easy to justify as a matter of public policy. But things have changed, right? And so we now have workfare income supplement, right? So it is an attempt to recognize that economic globalization doesn't benefit everyone, but as a society, we cannot just leave these people by the wayside. So that there is a need to try to help the others to level up. And so you can see that, yes, there is that pragmatic consideration of wanting to be open to globalization, but there's also the recognition that we need more than just pragmatism. So, Madam Chair, it's not just about preferring one over the other, but it's really about being even-handed.
Being even-handed, okay. Anything else? Vikram, do you want to add something? Or?
Well, I think the position is we're not against pragmatism. I mean, like I said, it's like motherhood. Nobody's against it. The problem is, if you want to make it the sole ruling philosophy.
Or the most important ruling philosophy.
No, that's not what the motion says. The motion says pragmatism is
We've
our
had
governing
several
philosophy.
discussions on the motion.
No, but anyway, I don't want to be too technical. But, I mean, we also need a moral compass. We need principles. We need things that, as the PM said, are unshakable. We don't have rule of law because it's pragmatic. We have rule of law because it's intrinsically good in and of itself. We don't have meritocracy or interracial harmony because it's pragmatic. Because it is good. I think we have to have things that are intrinsically good in and of themselves, whether they are pragmatic or not. So I think that's the difference.
Thank you, Vikram. I'd like to now open the floor to questions. If you'd like to pose it to a particular member of the team, please let us know. Anybody? We have until 3 o'clock. Gentleman over there in blue, could you please identify yourself when you get to the mic, and whether or not you're opening the question to everyone, either team or to specific people.
Hello. Hi. I'm Jared. I think this is for everyone, I think. But so we were talking about philosophy, so I thought I want to take a page from Plato's The Republic and ask about, this, right? So my thought is, I think pragmatism is a kind of governing philosophy. It applies not just for states, but perhaps for people too. You might think people kind of governing philosophies, right? So it seems to me that somebody whose governing philosophy is pragmatism isn't a very good person, right? Might not be, right? So oftentimes as friends, as parents, as children, I don't want my mom to be pragmatic in regards to me, right? I want her to kind of love me even though, she might not get a good cost-benefit returns, right? I want her to love me even though she might not take reputational damage. It should never be that kind of pragmatic consideration. And so, given that people, often shouldn't be pragmatic, maybe we want to think that states also shouldn't always be pragmatic. At least that's a kind of governing philosophy. Does that sound right? Or, is there some problem with analogy between people and states? Or where have I gone wrong? Thanks.
Jared, obviously you're not married. Are you posing that question to anybody in particular?
I'll volunteer to answer.
Thank you, Vikram.
Thank you for that very interesting question. I mean, it is true that pragmatism can also become a personal belief system. I don't know if you've seen the movie by Woody Allen called Whatever Works. It's a fantastic movie. Very, very, very quickly, it's about this 70-something-year-old guy in New York called Bernie Yelnikoff, and he decides, he has a very bleak view of life, and he decides that he should just do whatever works to make him happy. And then every character in the film has the same philosophy. We just do whatever works. And so he gets married to a woman 50 years younger than him, and then he divorces her. And her parents, who are from the south of the US and very religious, they come to New York to try and rescue their daughter from this dirty old man. And then the mother, who is a strict Christian, discovers New York, and then she decides to become an avant-garde photographer and has multiple boyfriends. And the father, who is also religious, comes to New York and discovers that he's gay, and he can have a gay life in New York, and so on. And the movie, now this is a comedy, of course, this is Woody Allen, but I think it's very illustrative of how, what happens when people adopt a philosophy of whatever works in their personal life. And on this topic, by the way, just to stretch it a little bit, there's a guru of pragmatism in China called Ding Yuanze, who's written a book called Square and Round, which is pragmatic advice on how to live your life. I mean, I think there's some very interesting tips here. So he says, to show indifference to another person, release your handshake immediately on contact. Okay? If you want to make advances to a certain lady, you should take advantage when she is sick. This will surely be effective, because at this time she is weak and most in need of comfort. If you want to buy cheap clothes, ask the price of expensive clothes first. This is a good one. If you have a small request, first make a large request.
That's what we all do with our bosses, right?
And let the other person refuse. When he feels apologetic, then make your small request.
Small increment,
So
not
this
a
is
promotion.
a pragmatic guru. He's like a perversion of an American self-help book. Now this is the sort of behavior that you get when people make pragmatism a personal belief system. And I think that's dangerous, and that can happen. I'm not saying it always, but all people are, of course, not like that. Most people are not like that. Most people believe in principle, most people believe in morality, and most people have a moral compass. So when you appeal to people, you have to show those qualities. You can't say, oh, wait, I'm doing this because it's pragmatic. You have to say, I'm doing this because it's right.
Thank you, Vikram. Would anybody like to respond or to say anything? Thank you, Tong Yi. By the way, there's supposed to be a 2-minute limit, but the clock seems to have stopped working. Hence, they've been going on a little bit. But I'll let them carry on since it's a free and open round.
I've got two quick responses to this. I think the first one is that, and I want to make sure that we don't distract from the notion, right, or this motion here, that it really is about pragmatism being our governing philosophy. I think every single individual has every right to be whatever it is they choose to be, right? And I have every right to be idealistic, and I really am, right? I find myself weird sitting on this particular side of the whole table of things. But I think if we look at this idea, we aren't against what basically the opposition is saying. Right? You guys are saying over here there needs to be some sort of balance, we have to strike some sort of balance there, and I absolutely get it. But the question is really whether pragmatism should be the governing philosophy, right, at the end of the day. So, if we look at, damn it, I lost my train of thought.
It's okay, you're not live on television, you will be recorded. Not too bad.
No, I lost it. You good?
Kishore will rescue you now.
No, I mean, I must say, I love the story about Woody Allen. And, you know, I must say one of the great things about having lived in New York is to watch a lot of Woody Allen movies, you know. And people watch them, people enjoy them, but to the best of my knowledge, very few people replicate what they see in the Woody Allen movie in their personal lives. So, and that's not what this debate is about. It's not what you do in your personal lives. And I would certainly agree, in your personal lives, the most important and fundamental thing to do, right, is to be moral and ethical and do the right thing. That is the case in your personal life. But remember that nation states are different from human beings. The tragedy of history, and there are 5,000 years of human history you can go back and refer to, which shows you that when states, especially small states, begin to behave like priests and begin to behave like saints, they end up in deep trouble. So that's not what we are debating today. We're not debating what you should do in your personal lives. I completely support the opposition when they say, hey, we should not be pragmatic in our personal lives. But that's not what the debate is about. The debate is about what states should do, and more importantly, what small states should do. And I hope that when you come to the final round of voting, please remember that you're voting about states and not human beings.
I gathered my train of thought. Let me put it this way. When I first chose to come to, run this bigger debate, I asked myself the question, why on earth would you agree for something so stupidly insane, right, to sit down and do this? But I deeply love Singapore. I'm very, very proud of it. And I'm not of a position to say itself I'm proud of Singapore because we've been completely pragmatic. I think it's been a sound, realistic philosophy, but at the same time, we've also been very courageous at many points in time. We've been bold, and when we look at basically, even why we're debating about this, I think the question is that we have something to be very proud of. And I don't think that feeling of pride has come from a completely Machiavellian, utilitarian sort of approach. Singapore has balanced it as well as it possibly can. And I think as far as the state is concerned, yes, we have pragmatism as a governing philosophy, but I don't think we have lost all those other ideals or values, right, that make us stand out as a very small, very proud nation.
Sorry, Deborah, just
Thank you.
one. Kishore, I
Carry
totally
on.
agree that we are talking about states and not about personal behavior. We are only answering the gentleman's question. He asked about personal behavior.
Okay,
So,
now
but that said, I do think it's not irrelevant. I think if a state exhibits 100% pragmatism in everything it does, I think that does influence people's personal behavior. That can. It should not, but it can, and it does in some cases.
Okay, I would like to take control back of the debate and open it back to the floor. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Is this on? Yeah. My name is Paul
No,
Tambaya.
this gentleman right
sorry.
here. Sorry, I was pointing to this person.
Oh,
I
sorry.
can't see the rest. I can't see the rest of the room. If you could bring a mic to this gentleman first, and if you, lights are in our eyes. Apologies, whoever it was, the other person. Maybe we could carry on with you later.
My question is directed at the opposition. If I may suggest, if pragmatism is not to be our governing philosophy, then presumably the corollary to that is ideology should be our governing philosophy. So let me posit to you the circumstance of Charlie Hebdo. Freedom of speech is an ideology. If ideology is to be a governing philosophy, then you should have complete freedom of speech under any circumstance. That is numero uno. Then you wind up with Charlie Hebdo. A pragmatic view would say freedom of speech is a good thing, but you need to temper it with what is practical and what is appropriate for society at large. And then you would say maybe you want to temper that ideology with a sense of what is real and practical in a multiracial society. So in that context, do you really think that ideology should trump pragmatism?
So thanks, Piyush. I don't think we ever said that we should throw out pragmatism and substitute ideology. Pragmatism must be there. Pragmatism should be an element of any governing philosophy. But it's not the whole thing. That's the point. The motion says pragmatism should be the governing philosophy, not that our philosophy should be tempered by pragmatism. So we totally agree with you. You cannot take a sort of black and white ideological view of the whole Charlie Hebdo issue.
Eugene, carry on. Yes.
Yeah. So, you see, don't be blindsided, right? Like it or not, pragmatism, as is practiced in Singapore, can operate and does operate as a form of ideology, right? It says, let's focus on what works. Right? It doesn't matter, how you're going to get there, by and large. And so I think it's important that we not be fooled, by the proposition's view, right? In that we are proposing an ideological stand. I think there will always be competing ideologies, right? And I think what is important is to try to be even-handed, right? So the freedom of speech is as important in our society as the right of people not to be offended, particularly when it comes to their religious beliefs. And we're not saying that we should sacrifice one at the other, right? So it's really approaching it in a contextual matter, right? So the text, the Constitution, for example, would have to operate within a context. And so I think it's important to recognize that.
Okay, thank you, Eugene. Would you like to say anything, Kishore?
No, actually, I now begin to understand why they got more votes in the second round, because actually they seem to be agreeing with us more and more. I know they're in a difficult position. They're arguing against motherhood, but they're going all over the place. But seriously, I mean, you either say that pragmatism should be retained as our governing philosophy, or you say it should be dropped. And you should argue that it should be dropped, and you're not arguing that.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back, if you could just give us your name and where you're
thanks.
from. Sorry, Piyush couldn't see you.
Hi. It's okay. My name is Paul Tambaya from the medical school. My question is actually directed at Professor Mahbubani. You can hear me? Yeah, you quoted from Mr. Rajaratnam. I'd like to give you another quote from Mr. Rajaratnam, who was famously quoted as saying, Singaporeans should not become people who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And in fact, if you think about it, 50 years ago, we had world champion badminton players. We had a hockey team that went to the Olympics and did not get thrashed 16-1 by Malaysia. We had the center of the Malay film industry, and we had a dynamic rock and roll culture. But all of those things were rejected because they were not pragmatic, because they did not help deal with the basic needs of Singapore society, which was housing, which was medical care, which was all those other development imperatives. And so as a result of which we had to jettison our sporting and our cultural, some of our sporting and cultural icons at the altar of pragmatism. So my question actually is, when it comes to an issue like sovereignty, which we discussed in the morning, do we really have to sacrifice our principles in support of what the current American president called a dumb war, a rash war, just so that we can achieve a certain amount of limited goals? So I really believe, in line with what the opposition is saying, is that pragmatism itself has got very limited benefits. It's going to help you in the short term. It's going to help you achieve the goals A and B. But if you want to have long-lasting goals, you've got to have something bigger. You've got to have something better than that. And I think the audience here has gone from 75 to 55, and the next step, they'll vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Wow, I wish we had a supporter in the audience as strong as in that. By the way, 3 quick points. Firstly, I completely agree with Mr. Rajaratnam on what he said about individuals, It is wrong for the individuals to know the price of everything and not the value of anything. And that's why I emphasize that in individual behavior, the most important thing is to be moral. And I completely agree with Rajaratnam there. Now, your second point, I couldn't quite follow clearly your point about us losing the cultural icons, because there's an echo effect up here. But let me emphasize that not all the decisions that Singapore has made in the last 50 years have been correct. Okay? Like any other society, Singapore has made mistakes. I mean, to give you a large and obvious example, in our rush to develop and modernize, we didn't preserve neighborhoods like Chinatown. Beautiful old districts were torn down. But that was the price we paid for rapid development in the early days. So we made mistakes. The critical question is, if you are pragmatic, you learn from your mistakes. And that's what Singapore has been doing over the years. Now, finally, your point about the Iraq war, you're right. There are people who are opposed to it, and there are reasons for opposing it. But the question is, what should Singapore as a small state do? Now, I can tell you, and I hope to do that in my closing remarks, to give you examples of how when countries become moralistic, they suffer.
Thank you. Would either of you like to respond to that? If not, we'll open the floor to questions again. Next question, please. At the back there, gentlemen.
Hi, my name is Rahul. So my question is for the opposition. And you're essentially arguing that pragmatism should not be our governing philosophy. So then the question is, what ought our governing philosophy to be? I know you've mentioned value and ideals, but if you could give specifics on what values, on what ideals our governing philosophy should be grounded on, what are your thoughts?
I think I mentioned in my brief remarks that we should have a pragmatic approach to our governing philosophy. That is completely different from saying pragmatism should be our governing philosophy. A pragmatic approach would include elements of pragmatism. Of course, there are times when we have to be pragmatic. There are times when we also have to be moral. There are times when we have to take a stand on what is right and wrong. There are times when we have to have things that are unshakable and have to be done whether they are pragmatic or not. We had mentioned the rule of law, interethnic harmony, meritocracy. Now, there are societies who have ditched these things. There are the societies who have ditched the rule of law. The rule of law has become the rule of man, the rule of some man. Now, that's not what Singapore can do. They did that because somebody thought it would be pragmatic for him, that is, or the ruling clique. So there are many elements of what our governing philosophy should contain. Pragmatism is an important one of them, but it is only one of them. Thanks.
Either of you like to take that question on? No? Somebody else from the floor? In front, there's a gentleman here.
My question to the proposition team is this. Could you please elaborate clearly to Singapore citizens what's the pragmatic value of the national pledge? Because for the layman on the street, if really we do not deeply believe the idealism should be our governing philosophy of the government, however, we need to make it live in a pragmatic way rather than another way around. So I deeply believe that the idealism should be our governing philosophy. So otherwise, if I propose to you, to the proposition team, let's abolish the national pledge, what's the pragmatic value for the layman on the street to reset the national pledge every national day?
Okay. Could you tell us your name and where you're from, please?
My name is Henry from a local VWO organization.
So the question is, what is the practical purpose? What is the purpose of reciting the pledge? What is the purpose of having a pledge?
I mean, for me, this is entirely tied to context. I mean, if you're dealing with a multi-religious, multicultural, very young nation, I think the national pledge is one of the most pragmatic things you will ever see. It talks about equal opportunity. It talks about the fact itself that we treat all people equal. And although one nation itself, I mean, one ideal, it is pushing for a certain ideal, but it is very pragmatic. Right, absolutely.
Anybody else? Over there. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
My name is Osman from Pertapis. Actually, I felt very connected with Professor Eugene Tan when he mentioned about even-handed approach. To be seen a caring and caring government, pragmatic approach is one good thing. But on the flip side, you could also be seen to adopt excessive or even extreme measure to achieve your practical or your pragmatic policies. So 500 BC, Aristotelian ethics already recommended golden mean, which is shared in Islam, in Christian, in Buddhism, where in any approach, any policy, you have to take a middle mean between the extreme of excess of defect or excesses. So you will develop a caring and sharing society, and everyone is not left out. But if you keep on pursuing a very pragmatic, on the flip side, you might be likely to be seen to be oppressive or even sidelining certain communities or certain issues which are important to the minorities. Thank you.
Would you like to comment on that? No? Anybody wants to comment? No.
I would suggest we adopt something like pragmatic golden mean approach. What do you say, Professor Tan? Over to you.
So, Professor Tan, please.
I want to thank Osman for his support. Hopefully he can persuade people at this table to support us as well. Now, I think it's important, as I emphasized earlier, to be even-handed, right? So we are not suggesting that we replace one ideology with another, right? But I think as society matures, we need to go beyond being pragmatic, right? It doesn't mean that pragmatic is thrown out the window. It just means that pragmatic will now have to coexist with other equally important things. Because, I mean, had we been pragmatic, well, we might as well not do with the national pledge, right? Because it exhorts us to do many things, right? And I think the proposition has, in many ways acknowledged the importance of not being pragmatic, but to hold ourselves to a higher standard, to bring ourselves to a higher level. Because is it pragmatic to do away with the minorities? One could say that. I mean, I have students who have said, well, we should have an all-Chinese workforce in our company because it's much easier, we don't have to cater to, for halal food during company events, and we can all chatter in the same Chinese dialects. But is that what we want, right? Because this is what pragmatism will ultimately lead us to. So I think we got to go beyond recognizing that, pragmatism is essentially whatever works, right? It is important, we don't deny that, but we need to rise above that and actually recognize that we shouldn't be enslaved by pragmatism, right? Because ultimately, we'll ask ourselves, what is the point of Singapore being here, right? We might as well don't exist at all if that is a pragmatic thing to do.
Would either of you like to say something, please?
No, I'm somewhat confused by the arguments of the opposition. Now, the key line you used, Eugene, is as society matures, we need to go beyond pragmatism. But go where? I mean, what is unclear about your argument is, where are you taking us? I mean, I know you keep saying that we should become more moral and go for ideals and so on and so forth. But are you actually advocating that we abandon pragmatism? And if you're saying that we should not abandon pragmatism, then aren't you agreeing with us? So what I'm trying to say is, what are you disagreeing with? Are you saying that Singapore should drop pragmatism as its governing philosophy? And if we drop pragmatism as a governing philosophy, where do we go? What's your destination, and where are you taking us?
You have to respond, unfortunately.
Thanks for the extra airtime. We are not we certainly take the view that pragmatism must remain part of a governing philosophy. We recognize the importance that pragmatism plays in having to deal with finite resources, but we need to go beyond that. Right? We need to go beyond pragmatism because society demands more. And it is also the right thing to do. I mean, if we say that we should just do away with the poor, the minorities and all, at one level it could be seen as pragmatic, right? But at another level, it would go against what Singapore actually represents. So I know Professor Kishore Mahbubani has been trying to press us to say, well, what then comes in place, right? And we have offered the perspective that we should be even-handed, right? That we should now try to have the even-handed approach towards pragmatism, balance that, with what it means to be a Singaporean, what it means to be in Singapore. What does our society stand for? And I think that's important, right? Because if we want to have a soul as a nation, we need to go beyond just doing cost-benefit analysis.
Yes, you may.
Just very quickly, You know, let me state a simple historical fact, which is important for us to take on board in this debate. The British left behind multiracial colonies in all parts of the world. Guyana in South America, Cyprus in Europe, Sri Lanka in South Asia, Singapore in Southeast Asia, and Fiji in the Pacific. And guess what? If you look at this list of 5, 4 out of the 5 failed to manage their ethnic relationships because the societies were not pragmatic, because they took ideological positions, and they all came to disaster. So if you're saying, if your concern is, say, ethnic harmony and making sure we all stay together, I suggest to you, go and study the cases of the former British colonies like Singapore and study why they failed. And the fundamental reason why they failed is because they were not pragmatic. So if your goal is to assure that, then the rest should learn from Singapore.
Can I jump in?
Sure, one more time. Last one.
I think Professor Mahbubani doesn't fail to mention that in all these countries, the British left behind a dominant race. We chose not to take that pragmatic path. Right? The British decided in Malaya, in Sri Lanka, right, to have in Fiji and all, to have a dominant group. We decided to go against that, and I think that has made a difference, right? And we chose not to be pragmatic. We chose to to treat the minorities with sensitivity, short of affirmative action.
Anybody else would like to ask a question? Gillian. Gillian, please.
May I just invite the speakers up there to engage the very specific policy issues. Firstly, a choice was made to license 2 integrated resorts. Was that a pragmatic decision for job creation, and do you stand against that? Another policy decision is that we made a choice to institute CPF, which is to beat our human instincts and not to plan for the future and force us to put aside money for our retirement. Is that a pragmatic choice? Was it an unwise and incorrect one? Third, we made a practical choice, a pragmatic choice to institute GRCs. It is a basic minimum guarantee that minorities will have representation in Parliament. A choice, was that a pragmatic one and an incorrect one? Finally, we make the government, which we've had for 50 years, constantly makes the choice to do public consultation in between general elections. It's a pragmatic and practical choice to engage as many people as possible as they make their policy choices. Is that a pragmatic choice but an incorrect and wrong one? So, can the motion conference resolves that pragmatism remains important and should be retained as our governing philosophy be turned down?
Thank you, Gillian, for the 4 questions. I suggest we take them by theme.
Sorry, Gillian, what was the first one?
First one was on the integrated resort, second was on CPF and choice, third was on the GRCs, and the fourth, that the government for the last 50 years has done public consultation between GEs as the way to engage as many people as possible. Is this the correct way to do it? So there were 4 questions in Gillian's 1 question. Would you all like to take all 4 at one go, or I suggest that we take it topic by topic? All right, could I suggest that we start with the issue of the integrated resorts and the decision on integrated resorts? Could I ask the proposition to take that on first, and then we'll probably overrun at this rate. Integrated resorts proposition? Is it a practical choice? Decision?
Yeah, Kishore's going to kill me for this one. If there's one thing that I can't do is I can't speak against what I generally believe. I understand that the reasons why we opened the integrated resort, but yeah, that was something that we chose for a pragmatic reason itself, and I personally am against them. I get that we've got a more pretty skyline right now, but on the social sector side, we're dealing with a lot of, I guess, people who have not really benefited from this. Yeah, so I personally would have maybe leaned over to the other end to do this. But I really want to present it as the idea itself that this is really one of the, perhaps, I don't know, exceptional things that we did. And I think that's still in debate, because really right now, we don't know how to begin to see that issue. I don't know whether you have a point.
So the proposition would have rejected its own motion in this case because he does not believe that the government made a correct choice there. Could I ask?
No. Just hang on. I think you misphrased. He misphrased what Tong Yi is trying to say. I mean, we did say earlier that the government has made mistakes, in the process of pragmatism, and you can argue that casinos was a big mistake. And frankly, in my case, I can just to be completely blunt and honest with all of you, my father went to jail because of gambling debts. My family suffered because of gambling. So if you ask me whether I would vote for casinos, my answer is no.
Would the opposition like to take that issue on?
I would concede yes. Casinos, I think, was a pragmatic decision. It's a job creator. It adds another engine to the economy, tourism, and it has been a success. And while there have been cases of problem gambling, there are safeguards to prevent against that. And I think the social fallout has not been that bad.
Supporting
So it was totally a pragmatic decision, and I have no problem with it. Okay, on CPF. On CPF.
Let him finish before you go on to CPF.
Sorry.
Is that Eugene would say something?
Yeah, I think we all forget who's the proposition, who's the opposition.
Yes.
I think the IRs were a pragmatic decision, and I think that's where many of us have difficulty, right? Because we feel that it goes against certain things that we believe in. That have we become bankrupted of ideas such that we need to have the IRs, right? But having said that, I think it's also important to recognize that we are also trying to square the circle, right? So we're trying to say, well, okay, we need the IRs for whatever pragmatic economic considerations, but let's see how we can create a virtue out of a vice. Right? How can we perhaps come up with new forms of regulation, that will ensure that the casinos, the IRs actually work for us. And I think to some extent it has, right? But there will always be that constant tension, right? And I think it is this constant tension that will actually help public policy to get better, right? Because if we had just been solely pragmatic, right, we wouldn't have bothered about, the social fallout that would have arisen from the introduction of casino gaming in Singapore. So I hope that sets clear that we are the opposition.
Thank you, Eugene. Well, I'm going to try to focus, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus the next discussion on GRCs. So that we just deal with that, and then Gillian probably will have to talk to you after this, so that we can carry on and do our closing arguments. So if I could ask the proposition to take on the issue of GRCs.
Actually, I'm glad Gillian asked the question about GRCs, because I want to emphasize that the word "our" in this proposition refers to Singapore as a society and not the ruling party. So we don't have to argue in favor of what the ruling party does. So the GRCs is a decision made by a political party and not necessarily a decision of Singapore as a society.
See, this is where Professor Mahbubani has revealed the soft underbelly of pragmatism, right? We are not clear in the end to what ends, or rather, who does pragmatism serve, right? Sometimes we're not clear whether it serves the people, sometimes we're not clear whether it serves the government, and sometimes we're not clear whether it serves the state, right? And so I would say, looking at Professor Mahbubani's response, right, it is clear that there are difficulties with pragmatism as it is practiced, right? Because it could easily be used to further, the ends of the ruling party. It could certainly be used to also further, the ends of society, right? So what I'm saying is, this is a very fungible concept, right? It is as much an ideology that enables the ruling party, the government, to use it, and to say that it works for society and that's why we should have it. So in response to Gillian, right, I would say it is a pragmatic response, to the fact that, as the government claimed then, that people are voting along racial lines. But I see also the idealism that is vested in it. Right? The idealism is, let's try to get political parties to behave in a moderate manner. Right? Because in order to win votes, they need to pool votes from the different racial groups. And I think that represents both a pragmatic response, right, as well as an idealistic response. As I tell my students in constitutional law, right, let's look at the policies, the institutions for what they're worth. Right? Let's, for the moment, put aside how the ruling party uses it to its advantage. Right? But I think it raises the real possibility that pragmatism can be abused.
Thank you. Yes, Vikram?
So just to add on the issue of pragmatism for whom, I think the issue that Eugene just mentioned, I think is very important. I think there are many questions, many issues here where it's not clear. I mean, you might say, yes, it should be pragmatism for society. But let me give you two small, concrete examples. Singapore has the highest acreage of golf courses among any country in the world. Who is this pragmatic for? Who does it work for? How many people play? If all Singaporeans were golfers, I would say, yes, build even more golf courses. But I think if like 2% are golfers, who does it work for? Another thing, I mean, well, this goes back to our history a little bit. We incarcerated a lot of artists and playwrights in the 70s, and then again we had what do they call it, Operation Spectrum, was it, in 1987, where more people were incarcerated. This served to stifle artistic and cultural expression. Was this pragmatic? Who was it pragmatic for? Was it pragmatic for society? I'm not going to answer the question. I leave it to you to answer. So there are a lot of things that we have done which, I mean, are of questionable value, and I would not say they were quite so pragmatic.
Thank you, Vikram. I would like to now invite the teams to make their closing arguments. For the opposition, Eugene, please, if you could take the standing mic. You have 5 minutes. Your time starts now.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, the proposition has tried to paint Vikram and I as a high priest of idealism. But far from it. I would put it to you that there would have been no Singapore of today had pragmatism prevailed in 1965. Right? We would have simply just keeled over and adopt the different courses that Mr. Janadas Devan outlined earlier. So my team's stand is that proposition undoubtedly remains important. Right? But I think what we have tried to do is to show how even in the different policies that may have come across as being pragmatic, idealism, certain values and principles have been alloyed in them as well. So I think being pragmatic is a given. But I think we must learn to leaven it even more. Otherwise, we become a soulless nation. Pragmatism, because it focuses on what works, would also mean that very often we forget about the fact that we may have choices, even difficult choices, because it just focuses on whatever works. And I think it's important as we move ahead that we must recognize that we do have a choice. And I think pragmatism, unfortunately, tends to curtail discussion, right? Because it just gets people to focus on whatever works. So let me just say that pragmatism will be wholly inadequate in our next lap. In fact, it will probably be the recipe for our downfall. As I said earlier, it can get us through the day, but we need more than pragmatism to get us through the night. In the book Drive, Daniel Pink reminds us of how motivation is intrinsically powered, right? And these are the three elements, right? Autonomy, which is the desire to be self-directed. Mastery, which is the urge to be better, to excel. And thirdly, purpose, the yearning to be part of something larger than ourselves. As you can see, pragmatism will not enable us to rise above ourselves. It will suppress whatever autonomy that we want, because we will all have to worship at the altar of pragmatism. It will not encourage us to be craftsmen, to be masters at what we do. Right? Instead, it will encourage us to go for what is expedient, what is convenient, and what are the shortcuts. So we must continue to have that sense of mission. And I think pragmatism innovates that sense of mission. Secondly, the proposition has tried to paint us as, put the motion as, well, it is about society, it is not about individuals. But isn't it individuals that make up a society? And I think it is important here to then recognize how the state's approach to many issues can ultimately affect how Singaporeans view policies. So I think this is where it can be very problematic for nation building in Singapore, because pragmatism encourages citizens to take a very transactionary approach. What's in it for me? That the legitimacy of government policies is measured in pragmatic terms, and very often that means in economic terms. So I think that's why we now have this overwhelming preference for value rather than values. Right? We look at housing, for example. Right? It is not something that we think of, it is something that we think about. Right? Think about how the Singaporean male has been caricaturized, when he wants to get married to the lady that he loves, you say, well, let's go and apply for a HDB flat. It's all about thinking about using housing to think about these things. I think thirdly, pragmatism, the proposition asks, where will pragmatism take us? Well, I think it will innovate us of our ability to govern. It will take away the energy for collective action, right? Because we will tend to think about what is it that works for us. So is it any surprise that on economic matters, people are not really getting into action in any meaningful way, right? Because they're constantly reminded that those are the issues that they're very worried about. So I think we must ultimately remember that it is easy to say that, mistakes have resulted, that we do make mistakes and that pragmatism cannot be blamed. But I think that reminds us that pragmatism also tunnels us into thinking about trade-offs. And I think we need to go beyond trade-offs. So let me just conclude. I think we do have a choice, and I think we should now stop worshipping at the altar of pragmatism. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. So I'd like to now invite Kishore to present his closing remarks for the proposition.
My partner, Tong Yi, began by saying that as someone from the NGO world, it was a very unpragmatic decision on his part to come and argue in favor of pragmatism. I have made an equally unpragmatic decision because I arrived this morning at 6 a.m. from Davos, where I fell ill. So you can see I'm slightly incapacitated in this debate. But when Janadas pushed me very hard to take on this role, I actually agreed because it reflects a genuine and deep personal worry that I have about Singapore. I do worry that when I hear Eugene says that it's time for us to go beyond pragmatism, to weigh in other factors, there is a huge danger in his statement, because one fundamental fact about Singapore hasn't changed, and that one fundamental fact is that we remain a small state. And fortunately, we have several thousand years of human history to go back and study to understand the fate of small states. And clearly, the lessons of history teach us that when small states, and I must emphasize, we're talking about the state and not the government, when small states stop being pragmatic, they get into deep trouble. And to give you 3 concrete examples of 3 big challenges that are coming our way, and I can predict these challenges. Number 1, geopolitical. There's going to be an enormous geopolitical contest coming between the United States and China, and I guarantee it. And if Singapore doesn't react carefully and pragmatically to this great geopolitical divide, we will suffer. Don't try to be moralistic in geopolitics if you are a small state, because your head will be cut off. And that hasn't changed. In the area of the economy, we know even some of the leading developed states are struggling to cope with the new forces of globalization, of automation. We have to change and adapt very quickly if we're going to make it. And if we stop being nimble and pragmatic, I assure you Singapore will be washed away very quickly by another wave of global competition. And finally, thirdly, to refer to the internal area of society, which is what our opposition has focused on, we still remain a multiracial state. That hasn't changed. And I'm glad that Piyush Gupta brought up the issue of the Charlie Hebdo affair. Because if you take the non-pragmatic approach and you take the ideological approach that freedom of speech is the only thing that matters, Singapore is finished. You know, when I was flying back this morning, I read an editorial in The Economist about the Charlie Hebdo affair that was pure rubbish. And if we follow that rubbish, we will suffer as a consequence. So you can see in all the big challenges that are coming our way, if we are to preserve Singapore as it is, we have to remain pragmatic. Now, a key word that the opposition used was ideals. I suggest to all of you, the highest ideal that we as fellow Singaporeans can have is to try and preserve this small island city-state, which has a land territory which is so absurdly small that it's smaller than a small island in a lake in Sumatra. And on that tiny bit of territory, we are trying to create a complex city-state that is competing with the rest of the world and trying to surpass the rest of the world. And if you forget that you have so few resources and so little territory, and you take idealistic and moral positions like what our opposition is suggesting, then sadly, Singapore will be finished. So please, I beg you, retain pragmatism as our governing philosophy.
Thank you very much, Kishore. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And it's now my pleasure to invite all of you to see whether your minds have changed again by our speakers and to take the last vote for the day. The poll says pragmatism should be retained as Singapore's governing philosophy. Those of you who agree, please press 1 and send it in. Those of you who disagree, press 2 and send it in. For all of us. Where is he? He's disappeared from the room. Ah. Aha! Swung back somewhat. 63% for the motion and 37% against the motion. All right, congratulations to both teams. I believe many of you I hope many of you found it very interesting, learned something from today's discussion and debate, and found it scintillating. I would have liked to have seen somebody argue that the Singapore government, or the government in general, is idealistic, is an ideological party, is formed from an ideological party, but is pragmatic in the way it delivers its policies to achieve those ideological outcomes, which are meritocracy, multiracialism, nuclear family, subsidized housing, healthcare, and education. That's just one way we could have argued it, but thank you all very much. I hope you all have a good rest of the conference.